This is the Week in Sustainability from Sustain.Life. It's where our team of sustainability experts and practitioners share commentary to keep you up to date on developing stories and news.
Hello and welcome to the Week in Sustainability. My name is Mitch Voss. I'm a senior director here on our sustainability team at Sustain.Life, and really excited to talk to you this week about the IEA, or International Energy Agency, 2023 report. Some of the things I want to go through and talk about are going to be discussing the significance of global CO2 emissions in meeting our specific climate goals, or meeting organization specific climate goals. Provide some insights into 2023 CO2 emissions and showing that there was an increase, but a limited increase due to clean energy growth. And we'll talk more about the clean energy piece in just a little bit. Talk about the advanced economies seeing record emission decreases, which I think is a great thing to highlight, and talk about what that means for the planet and for some of these economies going forward, as well as the IEA report detailed analysis. So some of the things that are in that report that I think will be great to A, highlight, but B, give you the opportunity to dig into further, and various sections that I think are important for folks in the space to know more about. Start with the highlights. I think some of the big findings that came through from the report, or definitely the biggest one, was that 2023 did see an increase in CO2 emissions. And that increase was 1.1% to 37.4 gigatons in total. Another key highlight from the report was around clean energy and how it has significantly contributed to slowing emissions, even despite various economic growth challenges. I think that's a fantastic thing for folks that are looking for decarbonization options. Clean energy is really, there are plenty of options out there for both organizations and folks to dig into and start to build or use that as their own decarbonization journey evolves. In using the clean energy options that exist, for example, within regulated, deregulated markets, within your own operations, to start to identify what you can actually do in terms of reducing your emissions through that pathway. One other highlight, or one other thing I want to pull out from the report, was weather conditions and COVID-19, how especially the COVID-19 reopening efforts has played a pretty strong role in emission changes, as well as potential challenges and things that are happening with things starting to reopen, with travel certainly picking up more, has driven a change in emission profiles globally. One of the other things, speaking specifically about weather conditions, I think 2023 saw a year of quite a few extreme weather events. I think that's something that is starting to, certainly something I saw in 2023, just based on several extreme weather events, based on where I am located geographically, and something I think we're going to start to unfortunately see more and more of. And folks really starting to think about both physical and transitional risk, and what that means for your organization and what you can do potentially to mitigate some of that. One of the things that I want to focus on next are the factors that were driving emissions growth globally. One of the biggest factors highlighted in the report was weather, with some of those extreme weather events and some of the things that we were seeing in terms of changing geographic weather patterns. It did impact or create a greater demand for heating and cooling, which is ultimately going to affect various emission profiles. That with those demands and with what is certainly on the cooling side in certain areas, causing greater requirements for energy to be consumed in order to meet those demands, we did see an increase there. Droughts was another thing that was highlighted. These droughts, especially for areas that do rely on hydropower generation, it means alternatives need to be used instead. And those alternatives are not always renewable sources. And that factor is seen in the emissions growth, that with the increase in droughts affecting the ability to use hydropower, other sources were then relied on to kind of fill that gap or fill that need, resulting in a greater emissions growth. COVID-19 recovery in aviation was another really key point or facet within the report, that as things are starting to open back up, as they were starting to open back up in 2023, we saw an increase in air travel. And that increase in air travel and aviation definitely created a larger source of emissions, or one of the reasons that was driving emissions growth globally. China's transport was another one where, with specifically two things opening up back again because of COVID, meant an increase in transportation specific to China and where we saw increased emissions associated with that as well. There was also a weaker industrial output in 2023. This had a muted effect on emissions reduction. The availability to some of the technologies, availability to some of the renewable sources that could otherwise be used. Next, I want to highlight some of the regional insights that came from the report. One of the things that I think is great to hit on, and that did come from the report, was around advanced economies or economies that are uh, larger economies, if you will, saw record emissions decline. I think that is great and really highlights the clean energy transition and clean energy shift we're seeing across the globe. That more advanced economies do have access to clean energy options. And it's something that is being driven certainly in industry, but through various other organizations and access to that for both organizations and individuals is only going to reduce emissions globally, but B, also provide cleaner alternatives that are currently or potentially currently not on the market. In the EU, emissions decreased due to renewable energy growth and industrial efficiency. There are a few examples that popped up, certainly around the various incentives or programs that are driving energy efficiency or industrial efficiency to start to reduce or to start to lower emissions impact based on it and driving more opportunities for organizations to pursue more efficient means or more efficient opportunities within their operations. One of the geographic ones I wanted to highlight too was in the US. The US actually saw a decrease due to switching away from coal-fired power plants. I think that is a great highlight, with a lot of the policies and things that have been put in place. Starting to see that is actually taking effect, that the switch away from coal power plants and coal as an energy source. It was a great contributor to that. There was an anecdote in there too that there was milder weather as well in certain areas, which may have had an impact on the emissions profile in terms of lesser demand for heating, for example, but not to diminish or take away from the impact that moving away from coal has had in the U.S. specifically. The other geographic region that was highlighted was China. And what we saw in China was an emission growth largely linked to the industrial growth that China saw in 2023. There was a few anecdotes in there too, highlighting less energy efficiency being driven through China in certain policies that are put in place there. Something for us to continue to watch and monitor, but just to highlight in terms of it, from the numbers and what's been presented so far, that economic growth has mainly been the driver for emissions growth within China. Another area we saw emissions growth as well was India. This was linked to, and the report does cite that economic recovery and a poor monsoon were likely a large contributor to that as well. That going through that economic recovery period or phase, it has meant a large driver in terms of pushing emissions up based on the actions that take place there. Before we wrap up, just want to highlight a few more global trends that did come from the report. First and foremost, speaking previously about the U.S. and coal, coal combustion was one of the major sources which contributed to global emissions. The two areas that were highlighted were China and India, largely being reliant on coal, did make up a significant portion of global emissions. Another global trend was the transport sector. The transport sector did see a significant global emissions growth. I think, as I mentioned previously, around the things reopening due to COVID-19, with air travel and transport in general. We certainly saw a growth with that within 2023. We want to talk about the global building sector next. I think this is a great global trend, is that the emissions are decreasing. In 2023, they did decrease. Some of that was potentially linked to milder temperatures and less requirements for heating, for example. But also the highlight of energy efficiency being a key player in certain areas, and overall there was a decrease in those global building sectors. Uh, Last thing for global trends was around China and India's growing emissions and how this emphasizes their role in global emissions, with being two very large players in the energy emission profile around the globe. I think it's a very key area in terms of, emission profiles and what is happening for their emissions in those areas. In wrapping up, and one of the things I want to emphasize is the need for, and but certainly what the report highlights from these findings and what is in here, continued clean energy and the clean energy transition continuing to be an emphasis to combat climate change. It's pretty straightforward and cut and dry in terms of, using clean energy does lower emissions globally, and it's something that continually is being pushed by various governments and organizations that I think is going to be a part of our transition, and thinking about physical and transitional risks, a key part for our transitioning. China and India's significant contributions to global emissions was another conclusion just want to highlight again. I think it does highlight kind of the urgency that is there within those regions, again, being much larger economies and contributors to global emissions. Global efforts should certainly potentially be focused on those two areas for that. Lastly, and just in closing, one of the things that I think was an interesting anecdote, or what is great to look at, as an individual, is that the per capita emissions vary pretty wildly across both what we'll call it those advanced or larger economies to smaller economies. The larger economies obviously having much higher than the global average, except for the EU, based on some of the actions that have taken place there. But just thinking about, per capita emissions across the globe and what that looks like for individuals, and how your actions contribute to global climate change is something that, is seen within the numbers, and something that folks should certainly reflect on. That'll be it for this week and the week in sustainability. Thanks for your time, and we'll talk to you in the next one.
Sustain.Life is the leading and most comprehensive sustainability software on the market. To learn how we can help your company measure its emissions and take climate action, go to Sustain.Life. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this show on our YouTube channel or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for tuning in. See you next week.